Hi, my name is Eben, and I'm a master's student doing international conflict studies at King's College London. I think it can be hard for anyone who's interested in the ways that post-conflict societies rebuild themselves to find materials that aren't written for, an academic. Especially if you're like me, a student that spent a lot of time reading books and journal articles. And that's one of the reasons why I was drawn to the digital journalism internship at Arts for Refugees, because I wanted to write something that was accessible and holistic, and different to simply writing another essay. So my own personal research interests are centered on contemporary history, security, and politics, especially in Eastern Europe. But I've also always been fascinated by how narratives have fed conflicts in other parts of the world. I'd wonder how on earth people are able to convince themselves that one group is somehow worth less than another. And I suppose that brings me to why I chose to write about integrated education. So over the summer of 2025, I went to Belfast in Northern Ireland. Whilst I was on a walking tour with my family through the city, seeing the, famous massive concrete peace walls with all the graffiti and learning a lot about the Troubles, he told me a fact that even to this moment still resonates with me. And that's, after 30 years after the conflict, something like less than 10% of children in Northern Ireland go to school with people of other religions. And this genuinely shocks me, especially as someone who was born and raised in London, with a mum who emigrated to the UK from Ireland in the 1980s. And I suppose it goes to show that even though the Troubles arguably ended in 1998, the divisions that were left behind still remain. A lot of the news nowadays is dominated by current conflicts, but once those end, there's very little attention given to the people that survive. The war might be over on paper, but to them the suffering remains. Then I started to wonder more about that fact I learned in Belfast. So I wondered if that was the case in other places with conflicts that also ended in the 90s, places like Bosnia or Rwanda. And as is fairly typical with me, I went down a rabbit hole and became interested enough to write an article on it. Past, Present, and Future, Integrated Education as a Tool of Post-Conflict Reconciliation pretty much talks about what's written on the tin. It tackles a fairly broad subject, but one that undeniably holds a clear role in rebuilding after a conflict. So I suppose I'll give a brief definition of integrated education. So it mainly involves teaching a curriculum that promotes critical thinking, acceptance, and open debate to students from various ethnic and cultural backgrounds, often in the same classroom. And the basic aim is to get them to question everything in a way that deconstructs narratives that were often spread during conflict. It teaches them to consider why a person in a position of authority might want them to consider a certain way or believe in a certain message. And the most valuable part of integrated education is that it tries to produce a new generation of leaders capable of empathy, compassion, and understanding. Things that are, well, to be honest, rarely seen by people in power. And instead of focusing on one location where integrated education has been used, I chose to look at Northern Ireland, Bosnia, and Rwanda. And all of these post-conflict societies have had varying degrees of integrated education. So in the case of Northern Ireland, the Troubles deepened divides between Catholics and Protestants. And Northern Ireland is a part of the UK, so when an ordinary person considers a post-conflict society, they probably think of somewhere outside of Western Europe, which goes to show that people still hold on to quite an insulated concept of conflicts that people use day to day. And in 1998, the Good Friday Agreement mostly ended the violence. But like most other peace agreements of the time, it didn't really include ways of reconciling the zero-sum identities of its people. When children belonging to a certain community are educated without any exposure to other viewpoints, the narratives that played a part in that conflict often still linger. And in Northern Ireland in particular, what I found interesting was that integrated education goes beyond the classroom to include sports, which is one of the best ways to unite people. So the best example that probably comes to mind is 1914 with the Christmas truce between British and German soldiers. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter who you kick the ball to. But in Northern Ireland, the process of transitioning to a system of integrated education is still ongoing. And the second location I look at is Rwanda. Now, Rwanda is a bit different in that it uses a form of integrated education that is state-driven. And the aim there is to break down ethnic-centric identities. But what differentiates it from Northern Ireland is that the history that allowed these identities to arise in the first place is not really addressed in schools. Instead, the state teaches a version of history they want others to believe is true, which I touch upon in the article. And having done history in my undergrads, I think it's vital that people know about history, so that they can at least spot patterns and events that may repeat in the future. Bosnia suffered from a similar ethnic conflict in the 90s between Croats, Serbs, and Muslim Bosnians. But it's not experienced any major attempt at integrated education, because it's so decentralized. And I suppose in that sense, Bosnia is the sort of laboratory where its impact could best be studied, which I suppose brings me to my final point. Integrated education is a valuable tool that can break down narratives and encourage critical thinking, but as I outlined in the article, it's not a silver bullet. It can't fix the roots of a conflict on its own. To implement it, it requires a lot of money, specialist teachers, infrastructure, and I think, most importantly, a genuine desire by people to participate in something that involves questioning their beliefs. Its true value lies in being used alongside other strategies for peace and reconciliation. So, for a lot of people, the conflict doesn't end when the fighting ends. But with the right support and strategy, true peace can be brought.